Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Learning from Leaders series. As always, I'm joined today by Peter Van Ams, author of the books Before I Was a CEO. And today we have the immense pleasure to welcome Daan Struyven, a senior economist at Goldman Sachs. Peter, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Luc, and good to see you again, everyone, at our next installment of the Learning from Leaders program. And indeed, we're so happy to welcome Daan. Daan, who is a senior economist at Goldman Sachs, who's a PhD in economics also from MIT, really a top school to study economics. We'll get back to that topic in just a little bit. But Daan, first of all, welcome, of course, and for joining us. And I have to ask you, how are you? Because you are, of course, joining us from one of those regions in the world that's been worst hit by the crisis, the public health crisis, that is, of COVID-19. You are in New York, isn't that right?
That's right. Hi, Luke. Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me. Clearly, the New York area was the hardest hit in the US. The good news is that following an intense lockdown, the medical situation is improving. And the world is gradually reopening, at least here in the New York area.
Excellent. So glad to hear that you're all right. I assume you're all right. You look quite all right, and I know you have a family as well, which we assume is well. Now that of course leads us then to a bigger question, right? Because knowing that you're okay, we want to know, of course, the things that you look into. Are they okay? You look into the global economy. That's your specialization at Goldman Sachs, of course, the well-known international investment bank. So we hear all these things. We hear the stock market going up and down, really almost like a casino. We see a public health crisis, which, you know, in some countries is getting better. In other countries, is still getting worse. I think in overall numbers is still increasing on a day-by-day basis. So what do you make of all this if you look at the economy?
Sure. So we estimate that global GDP fell extremely sharply by about 17%, sort of between mid-January and mid-April. And based on the historical data we have, this is almost certainly the deepest global recession we have seen since at least the Second World War. However, if you sort of define a recession as a period where activity is declining, where output is falling, this recession, which presumably is the deepest since the Second World War, may already be over in the sense that the recovery has started. In fact, we estimate that about half of this sort of 17% decline in global output that we saw at the peak has now been unwound as many economies reopen. Of course, I think it's very important to recognize that despite an improvement in activity, the level of activity remains very low. Labor market slack remains very elevated, and unemployment rates remain very elevated. For instance, in the US, it's right that economists were surprised by the decline in the unemployment rate in May a couple of weeks ago. But the level of the unemployment rate remains very elevated, around 13.5%, or even 16% if you account for misclassification. And to put things into perspective, after the great financial crisis, the unemployment rate peaked at 10%. So we're still well above that, despite a very rapid sequential pace of improvement. And that's an image that you're seeing in many economies across the world, still very depressed activity, but quite rapid sequential improvement.
Right. So that's something, at least I hear you say, well, things are indeed rather bad, but it could be that they can get better rather quickly as well, in case I suppose the public health crisis improves. Right. Now, when we look at the financial sector, which is of course a sector that you're active in with the bank, you know, in the previous crisis, these were the bad guys, right? These were the ones that you know were seen as being responsible for the financial crisis. Many banks also had to be saved by governments and got into deep trouble. This time around, seems like night and day. What's happening? What's the role of the financial sector this time around?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, we do expect some losses in some asset classes, and banks do have some exposure. For instance, we are looking for a pickup in defaults among high yield companies, or some losses in commercial real estate. However, taken together, despite the exposure of banks to these areas where we're expecting significant losses that are comparable to those in a financial crisis, overall, the banking system is definitely in a significantly better shape than during the great financial crisis. And I think there are sort of three reasons for that. First of all, coming into this recession, households, especially in the US, but also in many other parts of the world, came into this crisis with very healthy balance sheets, elevated saving rates, at least in the aggregate, and relatively healthy financial situations. And because of a stronger starting point for the household balance sheets, and because of very strong support of the government sector to households, we expect that the losses in terms of mortgages or consumer loans will be significantly smaller. And that's the biggest asset class that banks are exposed to. Second, banks, very much like households, enter this crisis in a healthier position with more elevated capital buffers, more elevated liquidity positions. And finally, a third sort of interesting reason is that to a large extent, during the great financial crisis, there was a run on several banks as there were worries about the quality of their assets. What we saw now in March and April was actually that households did run towards banks. Households sold risky assets. The saving rate in April surged to an all-time high. And so what happened is that actually a lot of banks saw an increase in liquidity as households brought their cash to banks as opposed to taking it away from banks, which happened with several banks during the great financial crisis.
Right. So overall, a much more solid financial sector, it seems, this time around, which will be necessary, of course, because there's a lot of debt that is being piled up, both by companies, of course, who need credits to survive, by governments who just have to print money, it seems, just to keep everyone up and running. And then, of course, the banks play a crucial role in making sure that that money gets to where it needs to go, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the banking system is part of the solution in this crisis. And I think more broadly, monetary policymakers are also playing a very important role by providing liquidity, by easing financial conditions, and by making sure that credit continues to flow to fundamentally healthy companies and to households, which fundamentally, as soon as the public health crisis is under control, should be in a good position. So I think the banks and monetary policymakers and fiscal policymakers are playing this crucial role in terms of the bridge between a relatively healthy starting point and a future, which is hopefully bright once we control the public health crisis.
Right. So that's very important, Daan. Now, still with all the help from the governments, with all the help from the banks, a lot of companies are in dire straits, aren't they? We see a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of companies have to restructure, get debt. If you were in the position that you were running a company and you were, finding these difficulties to even just survive, let alone keep employment up and keep revenues up, what's your advice, or what would you do if you were running a company right now? We're still in the midst of this crisis, of course.
Yeah, it's tough, and I'm a macroeconomist, not running a business. But what I can say that's happening with a lot of our clients is that initially they were extremely focused on liquidity, making sure they had the cash to survive, and also protect their employees. Of course, the focus remains on protecting employees and consumers. But I think the shift is now focusing towards how do we bring our people back, how do we bring our consumers back, and then also, are there any new opportunities? There's going to be some reallocation. Some sectors are likely going to gain. Of course, some sectors are going to be weaker until we have a medical breakthrough. But when I, for instance, look at data on retail sales in the US for the month of May, some areas are seeing stronger growth than before the crisis. E-commerce is an example. Building materials is another one. So I think a lot of companies are starting to try to identify the opportunities that come along with this very large economic and public health crisis.
Yeah, those pockets of growth, those pockets of opportunity. And of course, in every crisis, it leads to new opportunities, and it will certainly lead to a different world on the other side, if you will. Now, there are some very practical implications for the people in our audience, many people are about to graduate, are about to get into the labor market, and of course they have to decide now, what am I going to do with my career? Where am I going to apply? Or should I perhaps just take another gap year and do some personal development and discover the world? What's your advice if you were graduating today? What do you think you'd be doing?
Yeah, so I would say the somewhat unfortunate reality is that in prior recessions, students graduating in the midst of a crisis and entering the labor market in those years did suffer from persistent income losses relative to peers who graduated in periods where the labor market was brighter. So that seems to be a strong empirical fact. So, how do you respond? Of course, as a student. Well, first of all, it's very important to be resilient and continue to push for opportunities, even if it's just significantly harder. Second, it's probably also time to consider this as a good time to invest in your skills. Maybe learn a new language, learn a new computer language, maybe pick up another degree or a new skill. In a sense, the opportunity cost of learning is lower because the missed income that you would get through a normal job is lower. And then finally, I think related to the pockets of growth you mentioned, it's also an opportunity to pivot. There are clearly areas that are growing. Public health, medical equipment, e-commerce, redesigning our offices, redesigning our public transportation systems, home technology. There are areas of growth. And those are opportunities for young people with good ideas.
Absolutely. And surely we'll get back to that question, Daan, if you don't mind. We'll grill you a little bit more about the questions that the students have later on in this conversation. But before we do, I want to shift gears because, of course, you're sitting in that seat where you're able to analyze the global economy for a globally active bank, which is Goldman Sachs. A very fascinating job, no doubt. A very coveted job, of course, and not easy to get to. So what I want to do is, and what we always do, is a little bit go back in time. Go back in time to when Daan was a little bit younger and perhaps around the age of many of the students now, or even just a little bit before that. And I want to start because you and I, of course, there's a personal background story here. We know each other since we were young as well. I remember our bike trips that we did together as kids almost. But you come from, what can I say? You're fair to say, like sort of a middle class, but intellectually rich family in a small Belgian town. Is that sort of your background? Fair to describe it that way?
The town is definitely small, and my parents and family are very loving and supportive, and I think intellectually rich for sure. I had a very happy childhood. Spent a lot of time with our family over meals, debating the world, debating family topics, politics, society, economics. I owe a lot to my family and mentors. In addition to spending a lot of time talking about the world, we also did a lot of sports together. You were not the only one. I biked with Peter,
yes.
And we love traveling together, and also get an opportunity to see the world.
Right.
And yes, the town I'm from is relatively small, Tienen, but I'm proud of it, proud of my roots, and still quite close to my childhood friends.
No, it's a question, of course, that's interesting for a lot of people in the audience too, because we don't all come from. You live in New York now, and you studied in Boston, and you worked in or studied in Brussels, big international cities, but we don't all come from there. And it's interesting to see how you got from that small town, I think 20,000-30,000 people, to that metropolis that is New York. Now, the first step along the way was to go and study. And after your high school, you decided to do something which not all too many people do, which is to go and study in a university where the language they thought in, which was French, was not your language that you were schooled in or that you spoke at home. Why did you decide to do that, actually? Why did you decide to switch, let's say, the language of choice?
Yeah, so I was looking for a challenge. And of course, as a Belgian, as a Dutch-speaking native Belgian, I thought it was important to understand and speak well the language of the other half of Belgium, which of course is also quite useful in many other places in the world. It was, the beginning was tough. I still remember those courses in law with a lot of jargon and complicated vocabulary, and they were definitely harder, at least for me, than the math and science classes, which are pretty much the same in all languages. And so, I reached out to friends to help me. And my dictionary was probably also my best friend during the exam periods, at least in the first year.
Yeah, I can imagine. But you made it through, and after you did your studies, which were commercial engineering, as they call it in Belgium or in Western Europe, you decided not to go and work, which you could have done. I think you did internships at various places. I remember you went to the World Bank in Washington. You went to an investment advisor in Belgium, and perhaps even a consulting firm. I think McKinsey was one of the companies that liked to hire you. But you went to study some more. You went to do a PhD in economics. Why not just get into the labor market? Why not just go and work? Why continue to study?
Yeah. It was not because we were also in a financial crisis when I graduated. That was not the main reason. The main reason was that it was a big challenge, and I felt like that I had to strengthen my technical foundations to understand the global economy, to understand the world, and ultimately have more opportunities in terms of sort of the private sector, academic and policy jobs that I would eventually hope to engage in. And then, it was of course also very exciting from a personal perspective to move across the Atlantic, build a second new life, and in some way, to try to pursue the American dream.
Yeah, and you touch upon that right there, but and you talk about it very quickly as if it's nothing. But that was a big jump, wasn't it? You went from Brussels in Belgium to Solvay School, which is an excellent school, of course, but you went to the #1 institute in the world to study economics, which is MIT. I think various Nobel Prize winners went there, if I'm not mistaken. People like Paul Krugman and many others studied there. Many chief economists from the World Bank. I mean, this is really a very special place. How do you get in at MIT to do a PhD in economics? What's the secret? Was there a mentor? Was it just you being brilliant? I mean, how do you demystify this?
Yeah, so in addition to meeting the academic credentials, I think the support from my mentor at the University of Brussels, Mathias de Watripon, was critical. Mathias is a world-class economist, has a PhD in Harvard himself, was a visiting professor at MIT for decades. And when we worked on my master thesis on Belgian labor market policies, it clicked. I fell in love with economics research, and he believed in me, and he supported me. And that definitely was instrumental in getting accepted at MIT PhD. And I'm still very grateful today to him. We're still in touch. And a couple of weeks ago, we're on a Zoom discussing our latest work on the impact of the Corona crisis on the economy. So very grateful for that relationship.
But a crucial building block, isn't it? Because of course you succeeded and you sort of spread your wings and you showed you could fly. But perhaps without that mentor, without that missing link, if you will, it would have been a different story.
Yeah, he has been instrumental. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's something that we often forget when we tell sort of our leadership stories, is that that often behind that leader or behind that person, there's often a whole supporting team. You talked about your family. You talk now about your mentor at Solvay. And then, of course, you had to do it yourself. You had to prove that you were capable of not just the economics, but that you said it was not the hardest part, because, you can do it in French, you can do it in English, you can do it in Dutch or any other language. At the end of the day, the math is the math. But you also have to make a huge cultural change when you, of course, move to a country like the United States. How was that for you? Any particular anecdotes that stuck with you?
Yeah, it was exciting and very rich. But it was also hard, frankly. I think what's the hardest is just the distance from your family and friends. It's a little bit like the lockdown period now. We all miss those high-frequency, face-to-face interactions. And I think the distance is particularly hard when you need your support system, when life is a little bit tougher. I think many students who do research or do a PhD can sympathize with this, but the PhD or the research process more broadly is sort of a marathon. It's an up and down. And when we are at the down, having this support system is very important. And so, Skype was definitely my motto during much of the PhD. And of course, also building a local support system, friends. I met my wife, Lynn, also in Boston, who was a student there as well. And I think another time when it's difficult to be away is sort of when your friends and family go through sort of the milestones in their life. get married, get a baby, something happens in the family, and that can be tough. But I always try to puzzle and plan my work and study vacations around those milestones of friends and family, to be there when it's
and you made it through. That's clear. And as you say, I mean, we're going to talk about how you then landed or ended up at Goldman Sachs. But you mentioned your wife, so I want to perhaps talk about her and your family life as well. Because I mean, you're one of those people, of course, where millennials, where both man and wife, in your case, highly successful people, and of course, more than fully active on the job market. You have, I think, also a little family. One or two, a second on the way, I believe. And
1.9. The study's coming in 2 weeks. Yeah.
In 2 weeks. So almost there. And so it's one of the questions that then we need to answer, isn't it? Is like, how do you combine, that work and life, especially if both of you are so highly successful, of course, at work, but you have a whole family at home as well.
Yeah, so first of all, I think I got very lucky by meeting Lynn, who's very organized, supportive, and intellectually my peer, or I'd say at least my peer. And to be honest, there's no perfect balance. It's hard. You need to prioritize. You need to say no sometimes. And what helps me is just to carve out time, good chunks of the weekend, to plan fun activities with the family, do it together and commit to it. There will always be an email to respond to or a research project to work on. So I think it's important to block that time. And frankly, this lockdown has been good for me and my daughter. We definitely played a lot of soccer during my work breaks because we're all together in the same house 24/7. And seeing her during the day has definitely been a good thing.
It's clearly been an upgrade from the days that you and I played soccer together. I'm sure your daughter will soon put us both to shame with her skills.
Yep.
But of course you did succeed also, not just in being a dad and a husband, but also in being a very strong professional. And you after your PhD, you decided to then go and work for a company, and that's the company you're still with, which is Goldman Sachs. Now, when it was perhaps at first, a question, am I going to study a PhD or am I going to the labor force? Once you are successful and you are an economist, a lot of people will build an academic career. Why did you then decide after that PhD yet to go and work for a company, to go and work for a bank and become an economist there?
Yeah, so I definitely considered working at some top business schools. In the end, I went for the research group at Goldman and very much enjoy my work. I think presumably the most important factor here is that I can work on a broad range of pressing topics, really the topics that policymakers and clients are focused on right now. And the breadth of topics is just quite intellectually stimulating. And then I would say the people component is also quite key, both internally, we work in teams all the time, and also externally, serving clients, interacting with them, traveling when it's possible to talk about the economy with them. It's just something I enjoy, and that gives me a lot of energy.
Is that something that you knew at the time? Because of course, you didn't know your colleagues yet. So, did you sort of do your? I'm sure you did some due diligence, being a researcher and an economist, or did you just go with your gut feeling? I mean, did you have people around you that said, I do this or I do that. I'd go to Goldman because there's good people there. How did that go? That decision process?
Yes, I think I spent quite a bit of time with the future colleagues. Made a lot of lists of the arguments in favor and arguments against, but in the end, after having talked to a lot of people and gone through the arguments, in the end, I went mostly with my gut feeling and just my intuition that I'm happy in an environment where you can work at a relatively fast pace on a broad range of topics with people.
I mean, an interesting insight, a takeaway for me right there, that even the most brilliant economist and best mathematician, at the end of the day, will go for his gut feeling. But Daan, I want to ask you now, of course, you've been there for a couple of years, I think more than 5 or so at the organization. And obviously moving through the ranks of the organization seems to be going quite well. But surely the skill set that you had at the beginning, which was, I suppose, mostly analytical, has evolved over time. Could you tell us a little bit about that evolving skill set that you need to succeed and thrive at an organization like Goldman Sachs, and how you managed to gain those skills over time?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, and it continues to be important, being highly analytical and careful with data and careful with the analysis is the most important part. Over time, you evolve. I think it becomes more important to figure out what are the most important questions that our clients want to know the answer to. And I think you can get to those by reading, thinking, brainstorming, taking a step back, talking to people. In addition to sort of the importance of figuring out the right questions and topics, it also becomes quite important to lead a team, inspire them, and speak to senior clients. And I think it's not rocket science. It's learning by doing and getting continuous feedback along the way.
Yeah, very important, of course, and seems like you're doing really well. The last question I want to ask you before we turn to questions from the students, because there's many that have some questions for you. But I think you also have been able to work on your cultural IQ, isn't it? I mean, of course, you have moved from Europe to the US, and then as you briefly mentioned, you met your wife. I think your wife, Lynn, originally from China. Your children, I think, if I'm correct, will be learning Mandarin or are already speaking Mandarin, perhaps. And of course, you speak several languages as well. So how do you gain a cultural IQ, and how important do you say is it, including at your work?
Yeah, so learning Mandarin is definitely a humbling experience. I think at this point, I think our daughter, who's 2 years old, and I probably know the same number of words in Mandarin, but the gap will widen very quickly. I think another conversation topic we love is sort of trying to figure out what can we learn from different cultures, what's sort of the cocktail you want to make. When we travel to Asia to visit family, I'm always impressed by sort of the respect and love for the elderly. Europe's social safety net is just very powerful, especially when you get hit by those big shocks right now. And the reason I'm in the US, presumably, is just the pretty unparalleled opportunities you get in schools and sort of the business world. And it's very important at work with teams across the world, with clients across the world. And I think it's extremely important to try to understand them and learn about their background. But I think you don't necessarily need to work in a multinational company to get that. Traveling helps.
I might be going live, hang on.
Environment. Who are your diverse peers with a different backgrounds that you can learn from? So I think it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly you've gotten there. I want to turn now, if that's okay, Daan, to a couple of questions from students who have been filing in with their questions online while you were speaking. But first, I want to turn, if that's okay, to Liu Yue, who is also from China originally, who's now in Munich with EU Business School. And she has a question, I think, around the topic that you're probably well aware of, which is the US-China relations going forward. Yue, go ahead. Just wait for Yue to come online.
Hello, can you see me?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Yue.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Liu Yue. I'm from China. I'm really honored to take this opportunity to ask this question. It is about the US and China. Well, what happened between the US and China and has greatly affected the global economy. How do you think about the future relations between these two countries, and what will be the future effect on the global economy?
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. Clearly, the US-China trade tensions were a key reason why the global economy slowed down last year because of the decline in trade volumes, but even more importantly, the uncertainty that is created and also the negative impact on financial markets. However, I think it's also useful to keep sort of the magnitudes in perspective. We think that the peak hit to quarterly growth from the Corona crisis is about 60 times larger than the impact of the trade war. Nevertheless, it's very important that the phase one trade deal remains intact. And I think that the news we got overnight suggesting that China will increase agricultural purchases, which are sort of a key component of the phase one trade deal, after Chinese officials met with the US State Secretary Pompeo. I think that news is encouraging. Our baseline policy forecast for the economy expects the trade deal to remain in place. We think it would be quite costly in such a difficult economic environment, both in the US and to some extent also China, to sort of re-escalate the trade war when the economic situation is tough. Now, looking ahead, which is what your question is getting at, it's very hard to know how the US-China relationships will evolve. What I can say is that we already seeing in the trade data that you see some shifts in supply chains. Trade volumes from China to the US have declined over the last year, even when the trade news got better. And some countries, including Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico, saw an increase in exports to the US in areas where tariffs were imposed. So suggesting that companies and countries are trying to adjust, diversify their supply chains, and presumably the Corona crisis has emphasized the importance of supply chain diversification, for instance, in areas such as medical equipment. So it's hard to forecast, but I suspect that this trend towards supply chain diversification that was already underway before we started the Corona crisis will likely continue.
And maybe we can ask you, this is an interesting topic, I think. You had a second question that's related to this one, I believe, which was around globalization. Isn't that right?
My second question, you mean?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that about globalization. And well, it was one of the results of economic development. So I really want to know if it's going to be slow down after this virus pandemic.
Right. That's a big question. Globalization is, of course, a very broad concept. I think it can be useful to unpack it. I think of globalization as trade flows, tourism flows across countries, financial flows across countries, flows of knowledge, of communication. And I think there are definitely areas where, at least over the next couple of years, globalization will go down. And I think until we have a vaccine and a medical breakthrough, I think it's very reasonable to expect that the level of international travel will remain below the pre-virus level. And so that component of globalization is likely to be weaker. Now, in terms of technology flows, trade flows, financial flows, it's a little less clear. And diversification of supply chains in terms of trade does not necessarily mean that global trade volumes are going to go down. It could just mean that countries reorganize their flows, that new regional blocks emerge, and that, for instance, countries that I talked about earlier, like for instance Vietnam or Bangladesh, could potentially see a pickup. But some decoupling and some diversification in terms of the U.S.-China relationship seems quite possible. But
very
that
well.
does not necessarily mean deglobalization, I think.
Right. No, and that makes a lot of sense. And a second topic that I think we want to address on that front, Daan, is sort of the impact of COVID on developing countries. And we've got Jeffrey with us, Jeffrey Idean, who's in Lagos, Nigeria, and he'd like to ask you about the impact and the consequences, I think, of the COVID crisis on developing countries. Jeffrey, are you able to join us?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Nice to meet you.
So Dan, thank you. I think we've had a very inspiring session. Thank you for sharing a whole global view, both your marriage, your education, and how you started. I think it's been very insightful. So there's been this push for digitalization, globalization, and as part of the processes for people to cope with the whole COVID situation. But however, in Africa, probably take for example like Kenya, where people depend on tourism as a huge part of the macroeconomy. You have people whom all they know is like taking care of the animals, feeding the lions, and it's a whole supply chain process on who takes care of these, who's this. And these are not something you can digitalize. So, and it's come like overnight where people have not got enough time to prepare for. So what do you think these countries can do to improve their economy, not to get below? How bad is it, and what strategies can they employ to start steering the economy into the right direction this COVID period?
Yeah, it's very tough. I think the idea that more vulnerable pockets of the global economy, countries, people are hit harder than the higher income areas is very important and very true. I mean, within countries, for instance, taking the example of the US or Europe, about 35 to 40% of the work can be done from home, but it's primarily higher income earners luxury. People who work in the tourism sector that you identify, restaurants, the service sector that requires a face-to-face interactions, obviously don't have that luxury. So what can they do? I think it's of course, first of all, extremely important to continue to put a lot of public resources into fighting the virus. Economists and medical experts estimate that the return on investment from investing in testing, investing in contact tracing is just tremendous. And I think to the extent that those countries are able to control the virus, it will also facilitate the return of the service sector and of tourism. But it's tough, I think. In the meantime, what also makes this challenging for many emerging markets is that it's harder for governments and central banks to respond strongly. They have less fiscal room. It can be more difficult for central banks to lower interest rates because that creates exchange rate issues. So it is challenging, but I do think that long run, I do think that the demand and the benefits from globalization for emerging markets will remain intact. Kenya is such a beautiful country. I do believe that in 4 or 5 years, when it's highly likely we'll have a medical breakthrough, people will go there to visit. Exposure to manufacturing and exposure to trade in the services sector. Think about the telecom sector, for instance, in India, have been important engines of growth. And once we're through this phase that we need to bridge with policy support and public health investments, once we're through this period, I do think that those recipes of growth will remain strong.
Very well, thank you, Daan. And perhaps a final question on that topic of the impact, economic impact, perhaps also the recovery. Before I ask that question, I get a note here from the video team, if we could take back a little bit our screen, perfect, so we can see all of you. So the question is really about recovery. Many people are asking this. Leopold is asking this, Tushar is asking this, Daniel Quiroga is asking this. Everyone wants to know, what is this recovery going to look like? Is it going to be a V shape? Is it going to be an L shape? Is it going to be a W? Is it going to be another letter of the alphabet or something entirely else? And perhaps to give a helpful answer to that, what do you think is going to be the most helpful strategy, be it from central banks or from governments, in order to make sure that whatever recovery it is, there is going to be a recovery?
Yeah. So far, the recovery in the countries where the public health situation is under control has a lot of properties of a V, meaning a very sharp decline and a quick initial rebound. However, we expect that the pace of progress will slow, and it will ultimately look something in between a V and perhaps more realistically a 90 swoosh or a square root, meaning that initially the pace of progress is fast, but afterwards you continue to make progress at a slower pace. Why is that? I think the fundamental reason that the initial recovery is fast is that policy support has been strong. Fiscal policymakers have provided a lot of disposable income through unemployment benefits, wage subsidies, to support households and to support consumption. And second, I think we're learning, and I think China has been leading the way, that in some sectors, it is less challenging to bring activity back while controlling the virus. Think about manufacturing, think about commercial construction. In those sectors, if you adapt your work protocols, use masks, social distancing, you can bring activity back quite quickly. However, there are sectors where this is much more difficult. We were talking about travel in the case of Kenya, entertainment, sports events. There will be much harder. And I think we're not going to go back to normal levels until you have a medical breakthrough. And so the slower pace of those sort of second group of sectors, we think will cause the sort of initial V to look somewhat more like a Nike swoosh.
The Nike swoosh, sort of the longer shape. It's a very interesting comparison. I wonder what else we'll be able to come up with in the future, but I certainly like that image of a Nike swoosh. Daan, also, looking a little bit further ahead, if we do get to that recovery, Tione, who is based in Stockholm, is asking a question online. What are those long-term impacts of this crisis? Because, of course, you talked about sort of how industries recover. Some recover very quickly, some recover somewhat slowly. But, of course, there's going to be entirely new industries. There's going to be whole kinds of new activities that are going to be emerging, and otherwise we're going to be disappearing. What are some of those long-term impacts that you're expecting? And I have to ask again, because we really love to see more of you, if you can lean back a little bit. Thank you.
Perfect. In terms of the long-run trends that we're going to see as a result of this crisis, it's hard to know. But I think in terms of the macroeconomic trends, I would think about, and I identify two. I think the first one is the very strong role of fiscal policy and the comfort of fiscal policymakers to respond very aggressively. The global fiscal response has been around 10% of GDP in just a couple of months, whereas during the great financial crisis, which lasted several years, the response was quite a bit smaller. And so I do think if we get hit by a big or intermediate-sized recession, again, unfortunately, maybe in 10 or 15 years, I think that's here to stay. I think a second macro trend that is likely to remain in place, at least for the next few years, is low interest rates. And interest rates were already low coming into this crisis. Several countries had already adopted negative interest rates. Think about Japan or the euro area. But now the Fed, the UK, and a lot of emerging markets have also brought their interest rates essentially to zero. And as long as inflation remains weak, and as long as unemployment rates remain elevated, there will be very large incentives for central banks to keep pushing, keep interest rates low. And I do think that that's supportive of the economy. And I think it has some quite significant effects on the real economy as well. When I just look at the housing sector data across the world, they're actually quite strong. In many countries, the level of real estate activity is now already back or above the pre-corona crisis level. And that's because housing through mortgages is just extremely sensitive to low interest rates. So I think this trend of low interest rates is here to stay unless the inflation process changes. And it's also those very low interest rates, which in turn make it easier and less dangerous for fiscal policymakers to respond very strongly. So I think those two big macro policy trends are related.
They are related and interreact. Now, of course, in the middle of those two, I suppose, in a way, is the financial system and the financial sector of which you are a part. People like Bart are asking also, what you think the role of the financial sector in general will be going forward. Somebody else is asking a similar question about the future of finance. Now, of course, big question, lots of possible answers. But what is for you one of the big takeaways of the COVID crisis, working in the financial sector and looking forward?
Yeah, that's definitely a big question. I think conceptually, the two most important roles for the financial system, or the three most important roles, I think, are providing liquidity to households and firms when necessary. I think they have done that together with the support of governments and central banks. Second, and that's going to be harder, is sort of identifying the projects and the companies that will be healthy and need strong support and need to go through this tough period. And that may become harder if indeed we're going to see some reallocation and structural declines in some sectors and structural increases in other sectors. So that's I think a big challenge for financial markets and banks more broadly. And then finally, I think the third role of the financial system is to help households to save in a smart and diversified way. And I think this Corona crisis has just shown how quickly asset prices can move and how important it is for the financial system to help households to manage their savings in the best possible way. And I presume that the digitization we're seeing now, I think at Goldman Sachs at some point in the New York office, 99% of the team was working from home. I think the trends towards a more digital finance world is going to accelerate. It was already underway, but it's going to accelerate.
And no doubt this is true, not just in the financial sector, but in so many other sectors that move to digitization. We see it right here. I see you online. We could have met, of course, on campus, and we might still meet on campus in the future. I hope so, or somewhere else in real life. But certainly embracing that digital transition. So before we get to another question from a student live, Harsirat will ask a question next. I want to just ask this question that came from Kanaka, who I believe is based in India. And he's asking, well, okay, so I understand what the consequences are on the sectors that you talked about. If you look at the industries, industrial sectors, what do you think are some of the big industrial sectors that are going to come out winning from this crisis, are going to come out stronger? You mentioned, I think, construction or related activities already once, but what are other big industries do you see coming out on top of this crisis?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I do think this crisis shows the importance of public health policies, medical equipment, and sort of the whole medical sector, I think, is getting a big boost. And I also think that society's willingness to invest in public health and in the healthcare system definitely got a big boost. And I think it's probably here to stay. So that's, I think, a very important area. A second broad area is related to digitization, e-commerce, home technology, home deliveries for restaurants and other services. And then presumably a third area of growth has to do with how are we going to redesign our spaces, the spaces where we live, the spaces where we work, how we commute, how can we make the New York subway system virus compatible? So I think that will require a lot of good insights from people working in that area.
But that means, Daan, that you think that the virus is going to be with us for a very long time, doesn't it? Because you're talking about long-term impacts on industries. That means that, based on the virus, when we heard a couple of months ago, we're going to have a vaccine within 12 to 18 months. Is that then perhaps overly optimistic that it's going to be gone in 12 to 18 months?
It's tough. And, the question also is, how do you define long run? And even if we were to get a vaccine or a major medical breakthrough, I do think that the focus of our society on being ready for viruses and infectious diseases is here to stay. One quite interesting research finding that we found is that countries that got a significant SARS exposure in 2003, and SARS, of course, was from a whole other scale than the coronavirus, those countries often did a much better job in responding to the corona crisis. And so
countries in Asia, East Asia, Singapore, China.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Hong Kong, in Americas, Canada is doing quite well relative to the US, and the Toronto area had a significant local SARS outbreak in 2003. So it looks like that the experience of a virus has positive persistent effects in terms of how ready societies are. And so even if we get a vaccine, I think some of these trends are here to stay.
Yeah. Well, really interesting to see that there is some silver lining, at least from having gone through that previous experience of SARS. Of course, also MERS, a similar coronavirus that was with us a couple of years ago. I want to turn now to Harsirat, Daan. Harsirat, who's from India, who's studying in Barcelona. and who has, I think, a question that's a little bit more related again to your job and your career at Goldman Sachs. Harsirat, why don't you ask us that question?
Question is, like, Goldman Sachs is, a dream company for many students and many people. So I want to ask you, like, what is the major skill set that the company took from the candidates, especially during this time, and what challenges would be there in future while hiring a candidate? So, like, for the recent graduates, what advice would you give?
Yeah. Thank you, Arsirat, for this question. I think it's really a mix of strong hard skills and strong soft skills. We continue on the hard side. We continue to look for computer scientists, programmers, engineers to help us to digitize the business further, to serve our clients, to analyze data sets that are getting bigger and bigger. So I think that particularly is a big area in demand, and Python is becoming increasingly the programming language that everybody in technical areas in the firm is using and speaking. In addition to data analysis and programming and hard skills, I think soft skills are at least as important. You can have very strong analytical solutions, but in the end, you want to listen to your clients, you want to understand them, you want to build, maintain, and strengthen long-run relationships of trust to implement those technological and financial solutions for your clients. So I think it's really the combination of the hard and the soft that we're looking for, and opens up very exciting career paths.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Daan, for that answer. And I got to say, there's a lot of questions from students, as you might expect, who are wondering about that career and how you best prepare for a career in finance. Well, you look good after a number of years of having worked for a bank, so I assume you would recommend it to others as well to give it a shot. What are some of the other things that you think are good preparations for a job in banking and finance? Also, by the way, when you're a student, one person is asking, Natasha is asking, well, am I assuming now that you probably didn't have a student life when you were doing your PhD in economics because you were just working so hard and studying so hard? What are some of the things that we can do being students right now to prepare for a job in finance? Is it just about learning and sitting behind your computer all day, or are there some other aspects that we can do?
I think it's more than that, and it relates to the prior discussion we had. It's also about soft skills, and I don't think you pick them up by studying only. I also think you pick them up by through social life and through hobbies and traveling. So I think that's a good part of it. It was definitely a lot of hard work, but I think also sometimes need to recharge the batteries and take breaks. And my more generic advice, rather than what helps you in finance, I think is just to, when you're young, figure out what you're passionate about, and it's okay to experiment. It's okay to pivot. Our life expectancies is very elevated, and so we'll have long careers. And so that means that you have time to experiment and figure out exactly the best match between what makes you tick and the opportunities out there.
Very well. And I suppose studying finance is not a bad start. I know a lot of the students here are minoring or majoring in finance or considering to do so in the future. That seems still like a safe bet going forward, would you say?
I think fundamentally the sort of key tasks of the financial sector are here to stay. Providing liquidity, identifying good opportunities for entrepreneurs, and helping households to save. This is going to stay here. Of course, the way we organize finance is already changing and will continue to change. But fundamentally, the mission of finance has been there for centuries and is here to stay.
And it's going to be there for a while. Turning back perhaps in the last 5 minutes that we have with you, Daan, to some questions on the pandemic, because that's really on everyone's minds as well. Zlata, for example, is asking this question, which I think we all have, which is there going to be a second wave? Are we already seeing a second wave? Or, is this still the first wave that's getting worse and worse? What's your feeling on this?
Yeah, it's of course, I think the most important question for the economic outlook. And while we look for a sequential strong recovery, the possibility of a major reacceleration infections creates a lot of downside risk. Together, I think, with a potential weakening in fiscal support, those are the two biggest downside risks. On the upside case, if we get a vaccine quicker than expected, you could also see a very strong and more quicker than expected recovery. Now, we are not epidemiologists, but I would say that our economic baseline forecast is consistent with virus control that allows many activities to gradually recover. How likely is a second wave? It's tough. A lot of medical experts worry about it. They point to the fact that prior coronaviruses were often seasonal, and you often got a second wave. Point to potential weather effects, or the idea that when you go back indoors, infection risk rises. On the other hand, as an economist, I'm very focused on the behavioral response from individuals and policymakers. And the following empirical observation is important. I think most places in the world that got hit very hard in the first wave are seeing an improving virus situation. And that to me suggests that policymakers and individuals have turned more cautious. Mask wearing in the New York subway, the fact that super spreading events like indoor sports stadiums or indoor concerts are still restricted. And I do think if we can sort of maintain a good chunk of this behavioral response, that it is plausible, and it's our baseline that we'll not see a major second wave. Now, globally, the number of new cases is still rising, but that's mostly, I would say, new first waves rather than a second wave.
Yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed, and of course, work very hard, as you say. It's also up to our behavior, as you said it, to make sure that it doesn't get worse. To end, really, two questions that are perhaps a little bit more niche. Let's see if you can answer them from students. I wanted to put them in front of you. One from Tatenda in Zimbabwe and one from Julian in Colombia. Financial questions. Tatenda asks, we are seeing now sort of investors such as Ray Dalio and other economists plead for example, debt forgiveness for poor countries that are highly indebted as a way to get out of this crisis, because otherwise they might never. Julian is looking at the microeconomic aspects of it, and he says, what we're seeing here in Colombia, some proposals of inverse mortgages, meaning, if some people can't pay their mortgages anymore, why don't you allow somebody else to pay off the mortgage, for example, a younger family, and then when things play out, both sort of win. One wins by being able to live in their house, and the other one wins by having the right to live there when the other person dies. What do you think of these? One very macro, the other very micro. What do we think of debt forgiveness and inverse mortgages?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think at the high level, what I can say is that it's very important to be creative and open-minded about these kind of solutions, primarily because this is truly what economists love to call an exogenous shock. Typically, the argument in favor of debt forgiveness is that helps companies or businesses to stay afloat, and that supports the economy. The argument against is that it's moral hazard. You incentivize those countries or households to borrow more, or banks to behave in a somewhat riskier manner in the future. Today, with this cause being a virus, which is truly an exogenous shock, I think that argument, that moral hazard argument against creativity around that, I think is weaker. So I think there are, overall, I think those ideas need to be considered very carefully.
Very well done. And I guess we'll answer that question on inverse mortgages offline when we have more time, because of course we are in part a Swiss business school. We want to end things on time, and I see our hour is almost up with about 30 seconds to go. So from my side, Daan, what a tremendous pleasure to talk to you again, to see you again, and to hear you spread your wisdom with all of the students and the alumni from the school. So thank you so much, Daan. And then I'd like to turn back over to Luc for a final word of conclusion. Thank you, Daan.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Dan, for all your contribution and insight. I think it has been quite active session with a lot of questions, and you have come up with a lot of answers to our students. So immense thanks for that. Next for us, for the Learning from Leaders series, is next week already with Zev Siegel, the co-founder of Starbucks. Make sure to connect with us. Stay tuned. Thank you very much, and everybody stay safe.